In 1891, a Smokies herdsman walked out of the last wild hollow and kept its secret. His name was Ephraim Calloway, and he was the last man alive who remembered the original forest, the one that stood before a single saw touched those ridges. For decades he drove his cattle up through trees older than the country itself, and he wrote down what he found back there in a journal he showed no one. Then the timbermen came with money and maps, hunting the biggest trees anyone had ever cut, and the old man had to choose what the hollow would cost him. What he saw in there is gone now, almost all of it, and the only record of it went where no one could follow. There is a kind of silence that only lives in the deep coves of the Great Smoky Mountains, the kind that has a memory. It isn't the quiet of an empty room or a sleeping town. It's older than that, denser, layered, the way only a forest that has stood for centuries can be. Ephraim Calloway knew that silence better than any man living, because he had walked inside it since he was old enough to carry a water jug behind his father. By 1891, he was 74 years old, born in a cabin his grandfather built when the hollow still had no roads and no names the government cared to write down. Before we go any further, let me mention the book. The link is down in the description and pinned at the top of the comments if you spend your evenings in places like this with us. What you do there is the only reason stories like this one survive the chopping block, and we're grateful for every one of you who keeps the lantern lit. Ephraim was a herdsman, the last real one in his corner of the mountains. Every summer he drove his cattle up the ridges to the high grass beneath the spruce, where the air thinned out and the trees grew so tall their tops moved like a second sky. He slept under hemlock with his dog Ranger beside him, and he knew every creek crossing by the sound it made in the dark. A man who lives that long in one forest stops seeing it as scenery and starts reading it the way a preacher reads a page, line by line, season by season. The high country where he grazed was spruce and fir, the great dark groves that clung to the ridges above 4,500 feet, and he would camp up there for weeks at a stretch with nothing but the cattle and the dog and the wind coming off the peaks. Those high spruce stands were some of the last unbroken old wood left anywhere, trees that had never heard an axe, and he walked through them in the early mornings before the fog burned off, and felt like the only living soul in a country that didn't need him there. He had a face for that life. The skin was gaunt and weathered, the kind that cracks in the cold and never quite heals smooth again. His hands were knotted from decades of fence wire and frost, and he moved through the woods with a quietness that unsettled people who weren't used to him, the way a heron moves through still water. Folks in the lower cove said Ephraim had gone feral in his old age, and they weren't entirely wrong, because a man who spends more years talking to trees than to people starts to take on something of their patience and their silence. The forest he grew up in was the original one, the primeval woods the first pioneers met when they crossed the ridges. By then, almost none of it was left anywhere else in the country. These were trees that had been standing since before the Revolution, some of them older than that, with trunks so broad a man and his wife could hide behind one and disappear. Only about 4% of the original forest survived anywhere in North America, and Ephraim's hollows held a piece of that remnant, untouched because no one had found a way to get the logs out. He understood, in the quiet way mountain people understand things, that he was standing inside something the rest of the country had already lost. That was the weight he carried. It was the reason a man who trusted no stranger still let the forest keep its hold on him. He wasn't sentimental about it the way people in towns get over things they have never touched. He had buried a wife and 2 children in the hard years, and the trees were the only thing in his life that had never left him or asked him to explain himself. The forest was his church and his family and his witness, and by the time the timbermen came looking, he would have done a great deal to keep it from the axe. Around the year he turned 40, Ephraim started keeping a journal. It was a cloth-bound ledger he traded 2 fox pelts for in Maryville, and he wrote in it with a stub of pencil sharpened on a stone. Most of the early pages were the things a herdsman needs to remember: which cattle wintered where, when the first frost bit the high cove, which trail washed out in the spring rains. But the further back into the woods he went, the less the book looked like a farmer's notes and the more it looked like a confession. The Calloways were part of the Scots-Irish stock that settled these ridges in the early years, and they carried the same distrust of outsiders that the Hollows bred into everyone who lived there. It wasn't malice. It was survival, learned over generations when trusting a stranger rarely ended well. A man who lived past 60 in those mountains had usually buried someone who trusted the wrong person, and Ephraim had outlived nearly everyone he grew up with. By 1891, he was the last one who knew the deep coves the way a man knows the back of his own hand, and he liked it that way. He had married young, a woman named Ruth from the next drainage over. She had given him 2 sons, and then taken both the boys and herself in the fevers that came through in the hard winter of 1849. Ephraim buried them on the ridge behind the cabin and stacked the stones himself, and after that he never brought another woman into the house and never spoke Ruth's name to a living person again. The cabin held the shape of that loss in its quiet, in the second chair that was always at the table and the 3 hooks on the wall that held nothing. And a man who lives inside a grief that long either breaks or turns to stone. Ephraim turned to the woods, and the woods held him the way a wife would have, asking nothing and leaving him be. The journal lived in a chink in the cabin wall behind the hearthstone. The mortar had crumbled just enough to hide it. He never told a soul about it, not the few neighbors left in the lower cove, not his sister's boy Judd who came around when he wanted something. It was the one place he could put down what he had seen back in the country no one else walked, because some of it he couldn't have said out loud to another person, without them deciding he had lost his mind. So he wrote it instead, in the slow, careful hand of a man who had taught himself letters late in life, and he reckoned the page was the only listener in the world that wouldn't flinch or preach or run. The first time he went deeper than the other herders was the year a late frost took the chestnuts on the lower ridge. He had to find new mast for the hogs. He pushed past the last trail, past the creek crossing where the rhododendron grew so thick a man had to crawl, into country that had no name on any map and no path a horse would follow. What he found back there is what the rest of this story turns on, and he spent the next 30 years going back to it, alone, with the journal in his saddlebag and Ranger pressing close to his leg. The way into the hollow wasn't a path so much as a wound in the mountain. A man could follow it if he was willing to bleed for it. Ephraim crossed the rhododendron hells, where the branches wove together over your head and swallowed the daylight, and he crossed the blowdowns where the great trees had fallen in some old storm and lay across each other like bones. The creek ran cold and dark through the middle of it, and the stones were slick with a green moss that would put a man in the water before he knew he was falling. Ranger stopped at the creek and wouldn't cross, and the cattle he had brought turned back at a certain line in the trees and wouldn't go past it no matter how he called them. That was the first strange thing. Ranger would walk into a bear den if you asked him to, and a herd of cattle doesn't all decide at once to stop unless something tells them to. Ephraim stood on the bank and watched the cows turn and mill and low nervously, their ears pinned, and he felt the hair prickle on the back of his neck before he ever set foot on the far side. He hobbled the stock and left Ranger guarding them, and he crossed alone, and the quiet on the other side of the creek was different from the quiet on this side, thicker, as if the forest had drawn a line and was holding its breath behind it. He went on alone. The forest opened up into something he had no words for the first time he saw it, and the canopy was layered, a true old wood with the ground cover, and the saplings, and the subcanopy, and the crown all separate, the way a house has floors. The trunks were immense, tulip tree and hemlock and yellow buckeye and silverbell, their bark buried under moss so thick it felt like fur, and the soil underfoot was loose and rich and uneven where giant logs had fallen and rotted back into the earth. He had never walked ground like it, ground that moved under your boots because it was built out of centuries of its own dead. There were no exotic plants in there, nothing that didn't belong. Every species seemed to hold its own place in the layers without one choking out the rest. And in the lower woods, he knew, 2 or 3 pushy species always took over and shaded the rest out. But here the canopy was even and various, as if the trees had worked out their shares a long time ago and kept to them. Nurse logs lay across the floor with saplings growing straight out of their rotting backs, young trees feeding on the bodies of the old ones, and the whole grove had the feeling of a place that had been tending itself without interruption since before anyone kept count of the years. In the center of the hollow, the biggest trees stood in a ring. Inside that ring, the ground was flat and clear and quiet. There was a low wall of stones laid in a circle, knee-high, the kind of thing no animal piles and no storm arranges. The stones were rounded and dark with age, fitted together without mortar, and they were older than anything Ephraim could place. He had seen Cherokee graves and Cherokee cairns on the high ridges, and this wasn't that, and it wasn't anything his people had built either, because it was simply there the way the mountain was there, as if it had grown out of the ground the same as the trees. The air inside the ring was wrong. It wasn't cold, and it wasn't warm, and it carried no bird sound, no insect drone, nothing at all but a stillness that pressed against your ears. Ephraim stood inside it and felt the hair rise on his arms, and he had the sense, which he couldn't defend to anyone, that the grove knew he was there and was deciding what to do about it. He didn't run, because a man who has lived alone in the woods that long learns to hold still when something is watching him, but he didn't stay long either. He went back. Whatever else Ephraim Calloway was, he wasn't a man who could leave a question unanswered, and over the next several seasons he mapped the grove in the journal, counting the big trees and the stone ring and the way the trunks stood in relation to one another. The trees weren't random, they were arranged, and the longer he studied them, the more certain he became that someone had tended this grove on purpose, long before the Cherokee, maybe longer than any people the mountains still remembered. The stone ring aligned to a gap in the ridgeline where the sun came through at a certain hour, and the biggest tulip tree in the circle stood exactly where that light fell. No bird sang inside the ring. Ranger wouldn't cross the threshold of it, not for a treat, not for a command, not for anything. Ephraim would tie the dog outside and go in alone, and each time the silence greeted him like something that had been waiting. He found no bones, no markings, no sign that anyone had been there in his lifetime or his father's, only the stones and the trees and that held breath of air. Once, brushing moss from a stone, his fingers found a groove cut into the rock, a single straight line worn smooth by weather, and he pulled his hand back as if the stone had bitten him. The encounter came on an evening in late October, when the light failed early and he had stayed too long. It was the one that changed the journal from notes into something else. He had a lantern lit, and he was copying a sketch of the stone ring into the book when the quiet shifted. There was a sound that wasn't wind and not water and not any animal he knew, a low, steady tone like a string pulled tight and left to hum. He looked up, and at the edge of the lantern light, just past where the beam died, there was a shape standing between two of the big trees. He didn't describe it in the book, not really, only that it was tall and still, and that it was gone when he turned the lantern toward it, and that his hands shook so bad he couldn't hold the pencil for a quarter hour after. He wrote that the grove had shown him something, and that he wasn't meant to name it, and after that night he never went into the ring after dark again. What he understood, sitting by his fire that night with Ranger pressed against his knee, was that this place wasn't his to show, and not theirs to take, and that the forest had been keeping it the way the mountains keep their dead, for longer than any living person had a right to know. So he kept it, the way the Calloways kept everything, by telling no one. He trusted the woods to stay hard to reach, and he went back in the fair months and wrote down what he saw, and told himself that as long as the hollow stayed impassable, the grove would outlast him and the timbermen and the whole hungry century that was coming up the ridges toward it. It was a comfortable bargain, and it held, right up until the year a man with a map and a wallet walked into the lower cove and asked Ephraim Calloway where the big timber grew. He never told a soul what the grove was, not even in the journal. Some part of him believed that naming a thing like that aloud would be the same as letting it go, and he wrote around it, the way a man writes around a wound, describing the stones and the trees and the silence and the shape, but never once saying what he thought it all meant. In his own mind, he had come to think of the grove as the forest's heart, the place where the old wood kept whatever it was that made it more than just timber standing on a hill. And he couldn't bring himself to put a name to that, for fear the name would be too small for the thing it held. The timing wasn't an accident. Ephraim would have known that if he had cared to look past his own ridgeline. Up north and in the Midwest, the big timber stands had been cut down to the dirt by the 1880s, and the lumber outfits that had stripped them were hungry for new country. The southern Appalachians were the last place left with trees big enough to be worth the trouble of getting them out, and a logging boom had begun that would run hard for the next 30 years, paid for almost entirely with money from outside the mountains. Men who brought that money didn't live in the hollows, and they didn't plan to leave anything standing when they were done. The man who came to Ephraim's Cove was named Lowell, a surveyor and buyer for a timber outfit out of Cincinnati, and he arrived on a fine Sunday in the fall riding a horse too clean for the trail. He wore good boots and a watch chain, and a manner that was polite in the way town people are polite when they want something from you, and he carried a leather case full of maps with great blank spaces where the hollows were. Lowell had been buying timber rights from the hollow families all season, paying cash money to people who had none, and most of them signed because a full belly will always beat a standing tree. He was a patient man and a thorough one. The companies sent his kind ahead to soften the ground before the saws and the rails came up behind, and he could be generous when it served him and cold when it didn't. The families down the ridge had already sold, most of them. The lower coves were staked with the company's blazes, orange slashes on the trunks that meant the trees no longer belonged to the people who lived under them. Ephraim had watched the buyers work their way up the drainage all summer, and he had watched neighbors who had held their land for 3 generations take the money and step aside, and he understood that what was coming wasn't a question of if, but of when. Railroads would follow the buyers the way hounds follow a scent, and once the rails reached a cove, the big trees came out in months, not years, and the land they left behind was scoured and raw and good for nothing but erosion and regret. Judd Calloway was the one who brought Lowell up the ridge to Ephraim's cabin. Judd was Ephraim's sister's boy, grown now and deep in debt to a feed merchant in Maryville, and he had a coup of his own on the family cove that gave him a claim on whatever timber stood there. He was a younger man who had none of his uncle's patience, and all of his stubbornness pointed the wrong way, and he saw the timber the way a drowning man sees a rope. He resented the old man's silence about the back country, and he resented even more that Ephraim seemed to care more about trees than about his own blood going hungry. Lowell sat on Ephraim's porch and laid out his maps and his money. He said he had heard talk of giant tulip trees in a cove back in there, trees a man could ride a horse between the roots of, and he would pay well to be shown them. Ephraim poured him coffee and said nothing for a long moment, the way he did when he was thinking, and then he lied. He told Lowell that the back cove was nothing but blowdown and scree, that the big trees had gone down in a storm years back, that no man in his right mind would drag logs out of a hole that steep. It was a clean lie, told in a steady voice, and Lowell watched him across the cup and didn't look like he believed a word of it. What Ephraim didn't know was that the journal was already out of the wall. Judd had found it a week before, pulling the loose hearthstone, looking for the old man's hidden cache, and he had sat on the cabin floor reading the pages until the light gave out. He couldn't make sense of all of it, the sketches of the stone ring and the notes about the silence and the shape in the lantern light, but he understood the part that mattered to him. His uncle had found a grove of the biggest tulip trees in the Smokies, back in a hollow with no name, and he had sat on it for 30 years while his own family went broke. Judd didn't say a word to Ephraim about any of it. He tucked the journal into the bottom of his pack, under the extra shirt and the tin of tobacco, and he let the old man lie to Lowell about the blowdown and the scree. He had his own plan, which was to let his uncle think the secret was safe, and then to guide Lowell to the grove himself once the deal was signed, and to take the finder's share that would pull him out of debt for good. It was the kind of plan a desperate man thinks is clever, and it rested on the belief that his uncle would never do anything worse than sulk. The pages he couldn't parse nagged at him in the nights. There were the sketches of the stone ring and the careful notes about a silence that listened and a shape that stood at the edge of the light. Judd wasn't a man for spooky talk, and he put most of it down to an old man's loneliness and too many years alone in the woods, but the parts about the trees were clear enough. Big tulip trees, the biggest his uncle had ever measured, standing in a ring in a cove that no map reached, and that was the only part Judd needed to believe. The rest he figured was Ephraim dressing up a timber find to make it sound like a sermon, the way the old man did with everything. Lowell spread his map on the porch rail. He showed Ephraim the blank space where the hollow should be, and traced the ridge line with a clean fingernail and asked again, easy and patient, about the timber back in there. Ephraim looked at that blank space and felt the grove sitting in it like a stone in his chest, and he doubled down on the lie, swearing the cove was impassable and the trees were gone. Lowell folded his map and smiled a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he said he reckoned a man who had driven cattle through those hills for 50 years would know a way through if there was one, and he would pay double to be shown it. So the noose drew tight without Ephraim feeling most of it. He had a buyer who didn't believe him and a nephew who had already sold him out, and the only thing standing between the grove and the saw was one old man's word and the hope that the country would stay too hard to reach. Ephraim sat on the porch after they rode down the ridge, and he thought about the journal in the wall, never checking it, never knowing it was already riding in Judd's pack toward the very place he had spent his life keeping quiet. This is where the story changes. It stops being about a man who loved a forest and becomes a story about what a man will do to keep one. And the difference between those two things is where all the trouble lives. That night, he was alone with the lantern and the dog. It was then that Ephraim made the decision the rest of his life would have to carry. He couldn't show Lowell the grove that was settled in him the way bedrock is settled, and he couldn't simply refuse, because a refusal would only make the man hire someone who could read a ridge and find it on his own. The only way to protect the hollow was to give the timbermen what they wanted, a guide into the back country, and to give them the wrong hollow. He knew a cove on the next drainage over that was steep and mean and crossed by a gorge that turned back anything on four legs, a place the family had called the cauldron, and he would take them there and let the mountain do the rest. The cauldron was a place the old men warned their sons about. It was a cove where the creek had chewed a slot through the rock, and the walls closed in until the sky was a strip overhead, and the water ran fast and cold and full of blind turns. Nothing had ever been logged out of it because nothing could be dragged through it, and 2 generations of Calloways had used it as a backstop for straying cattle, trusting the gorge to turn the herd the way a fence would. Ephraim had crossed the worst of it twice in his life, both times young and light and lucky, and he remembered the crossing as a wet log over a green slot where one bad step put a man in a creek he wouldn't climb out of. He told himself it was only a ruse to bleed their time and break the deal. Maybe some part of him believed it. The cauldron was hard country, but he had been through it young, and he reasoned that a man who kept his head could come out the other side with nothing worse than a scare and a thirst. He didn't say to himself, not in words, what he was risking by putting an out-of-towner on that creek crossing in the wet season, because a man who has decided something will rarely write down the cost of it in plain letters. Ephraim made the bargain the way the Calloways always had, in silence, and he let the silence stand in for consent. Judd came up the next morning. He said Lowell had agreed to a guide and that he meant to come along himself, and Ephraim felt the ground shift under him, but held his face still. The boy would be carrying the stolen journal in his pack, though Ephraim still didn't know it, ready to pull it out and prove the big trees were real the moment his uncle tried to swindle the buyer. So the 3 of them would go into the back country together, 2 of them hunting a grove that wasn't on the route, and one of them knowing exactly where the trail would end. They set out in the cold before light. Ephraim led on the old mule, and the other 2 rode horseback behind, with the fog sitting in the trees like smoke in a barn. Ephraim took them up the ridge and over, away from the true hollow, toward the drainage where the cauldron waited with its slick crossings and its gorge. He had chosen a dangerous road on purpose, for a grove he had decided mattered more than a stranger, and more, he understood now, than his own nephew, and he rode ahead of them with that weight on his shoulders and didn't turn around. The cauldron earned its name before you were halfway into it. It was a cove so steep the creek had cut a trench through the rock, and the trees grew out of the sides of it like something growing out of a wall. Ephraim led them down through the rhododendron hells where the branches clawed at the horses and the light went gray and thin, and he crossed the first creek on a wet log and waited on the far side while the others came across one at a time. Lowell's horse didn't like the crossing, and the man didn't like it either, but he held on and got over, and he looked at the country ahead with the set jaw of a man who has committed to a bad hand. The rain came in the early afternoon. It came the way it does in the Smokies, quick and hard and cold, and the creek began to rise with a sound like something waking up downstream. The rhododendron closed over them, and the world narrowed to the gray drip of leaves and the suck of the horse's hooves in the mud, and Ephraim could feel the drainage filling around them the way a man feels a tide turning in his legs. He had told them this was the route to the big timber, and now the route was turning into the kind of country that doesn't let a man turn around, where the walls steepen and the trail drops and the only way out is forward. Judd was up near the front now, edgy and bright-eyed. He was sure they were headed for the grove and the fortune in it, and the journal rode in his pack like a loaded gun. He kept asking Ephraim how much further to the big timber, and Ephraim kept giving him the same flat answer, that it was a piece yet, that the country was rough, that they would know it when they saw it. Every question was a small knife, because the boy didn't know he was being led away from the thing he was carrying the proof of, and Ephraim didn't tell him. Lowell had gone quiet behind them, watching the old man's back with the calculating stillness of a buyer who has begun to suspect he's being played, and that quiet was its own kind of pressure on Ephraim's neck. The gorge crossing was the last obstacle before the head of the cove. It was a wet hemlock log thrown across a slot in the rock where the water funneled through green and fast and mean. Ephraim had crossed it in the dry years when he was young and light, and he knew that in a spate it was a place that killed livestock, and had killed at least one man he could name. The creek was up now, brown with the rain and running hard against the log, and the spray kicked up off the water and wet the bark until the whole crossing shone like a slick hide. Ephraim looked at it and felt his age in his knees for the first time that day, the honest fear of an old body that knows it can't take a long fall and walk out. He stopped the mule on the near bank. Looking at the log and the rising water, he felt the decision he had made sitting in his chest like a stone he had swallowed. He could turn them back right there, call it too rough, take the deal loss and the fight with Judd and whatever came after, and the grove would still be found the next time a buyer hired a man who could read a map. Or he could let them push on across and let the mountain decide, and he stood there on the bank with the rain in his face, and he didn't say the word that would have turned them around. Ranger whined once at his knee, the way a dog does when it knows a wrong thing is coming, and Ephraim put a hand on the dog's head and held it there and watched Lowell walk his horse toward the log. Lowell went first. He was the buyer, and the buyer leads when there is a crossing to be tested, and he was a man who wouldn't be told a log was too wet by a herdsman he suspected of lying to him. He walked his horse out onto the hemlock, and the bark was slick with the rain and the spray, and about halfway across the log rolled under the weight of the animal and threw him. The horse went one way and scrambled back to the bank, and Lowell went the other, into the gorge, with his pack and his maps and his watch chain, and the creek took him fast the way mountain water takes things, down into the slot and out of the light before a man could draw a breath to call out. Judd was halfway across behind him, and he froze on the log. His horse planted its feet and shook, and for a second the boy was going to go in after him. You could see it in his body, and then Ephraim was there. The old man caught the bridle and hauled Judd's horse back off the log onto the solid bank, and the two of them stood on the rock and looked down into the gorge where the water was running green and full, and there was nothing left to see. Lowell was gone, and his pack with him, and somewhere in the churning at the bottom the creek was carrying a man and a set of maps down into country no one could follow. When they got back to the lower cove, Judd was white and quiet. It was a way Ephraim had never seen him, and the journal still rode in the bottom of his pack where it had been the whole time. The boy had been ready to pull it out and shame his uncle the moment they reached the grove, and now the grove was never going to be reached, and the man who would have paid for it was in a creek bed a drainage and a half back. The journal had gone with them into the cauldron and come out again, and Judd carried it home and put it in his own cabin, and didn't open it again for a long time, because the book was bound up now with the sound of a man going into the water. They told the lower cove the plain truth. Lowell had crossed a wet log in a rain, and the creek had taken him, and the folks there nodded the way they nodded at any news of the mountain collecting what it was owed. No one rode back in to look for the body, because no one goes into the cauldron after a flood, and by spring the gorge would have scattered whatever the creek hadn't already buried in the gravel downstream. Ephraim sent word to the Cincinnati outfit that their man was gone, and the cove he died in was no place for a crew, and he let the lost do the talking he couldn't do himself. Ephraim hadn't pushed Lowell, and he hadn't cut the log. He had done nothing a sheriff in Maryville could have hung a charge on if there had been a sheriff who cared about a timberman drowned in a back cove. What he had done was choose the road and stay quiet on the bank, and he knew the difference between that and innocence, and he knew it every morning for the rest of his life. He had traded a stranger for a grove, and the mountain had collected on the trade without being asked, and the quiet of it was the kind that doesn't wash out. The timber deal died in the gorge with Lowell. It went the way Ephraim had calculated it would, and the Cincinnati outfit wrote the cove off as impassable after they lost a man in it. Judd was too shaken to push the sale, and too afraid of the journal and what it knew, to go looking for the grove on his own, and for a few more years the hollow stayed uncut and unseen. Ephraim went back to it in the fair months alone, older and slower, and he sat inside the stone ring and the silence held him the way it always had, and he didn't write anything new in the book because the book wasn't his anymore. The grove endured a little longer. It lasted until the railroads and the saws finally climbed even the deep coves, the way they climbed everything in those mountains, and almost all of it went down the slopes the way the original forest everywhere did. What survived is a scrap, 100,000 acres of the old wood out of 500,000, and the rest of its second growth standing on the graves of trees that were older than the country. The forest that came back doesn't remember what the first one knew, and the silence that had a memory is thinner now, stretched over a country that was scraped clean and told to start over. You can walk those ridges today. You can stand inside a scrap of the old wood and feel the difference, if you know what you're looking for. The layered canopy and the nurse logs and the moss on trunks that have been there since before your grandfather's grandfather drew breath. But the deep hollow with the stone ring isn't on any trail map, and the men who cut the country around it never marked it, and whatever Ephraim Calloway found in there is gone now, or so well hidden that the mountain has kept it past the asking of any living person. The forests that came after don't hold what the first ones held, and the thing that watched him from the edge of the lantern light, if it was ever there at all, went down with the grove, or went deeper into the dark, where the saws never reached. Ephraim Calloway died in the cabin his grandfather built. He took most of what he had seen with him, because the only record of it had gone into the cauldron with the man who came to cut it and come out riding in his nephew's pack, and then gone quiet. The journal is the thing that should have told us what was in that grove, the trees and the stones and the shape in the lantern light, and it sat unread in a dead man's family for a generation, and then was gone. The way paper goes in a damp cabin, the way secrets go when no one is left who knows what they cost. The hollow kept its silence in the end, the way the mountains keep everything. By outliving the people who knew where to look, the last witness took the truth with him. The hollow kept its secret by outliving every man who knew the way in. If the mountains still hold stories like this one, quiet and dark and waiting for someone to tell them, then you're in the right place, and we'll keep bringing them up out of the fog as long as you're here to listen.